8 men were dead by morning in Indiana in 1981, and the first deputy on scene wrote the location as a parking lot because there was no better word for the place where it happened. At 10:47 p.m., the lot behind Miller's Tavern was already full. Cars angled wherever space allowed, headlights cutting through the weak yellow light that barely reached the far end near the dumpsters. David Harper, 36, pulled his brown Chevy forward the moment a sedan began backing out, taking the space cleanly. Tom Willis, 41, had been waiting longer, or believed he had, his engine idling behind the departing car. He leaned out his window and said, "I was here first." Harper shut his door and replied, "You were moving. I'm parked." The exchange was procedural at first. Voices flat, words chosen to sound reasonable. Mike Ellison, standing nearby with a beer in his hand, watched and said nothing. A few others slowed as they passed, sensing entertainment more than danger. Willis stepped out of his car and pointed at the faded white line. "That's my spot," he said. Harper shrugged. "There's no names on it." Someone laughed, a short burst that broke the rhythm of the argument and drew a few more people closer. Willis turned toward the sound. "You think this is funny?" No one answered directly. The crowd was now 6 or 7 deep, loose and uncommitted. People who knew each other just enough to assume it would resolve itself. Willis shook his head and walked toward the entrance, muttering, "Not worth it." Harper stayed by his car, the space occupied, but the dispute unfinished. Inside, music spilled out when the door opened, masking what followed until voices rose again near the doorway. Willis had crossed paths with Harper a second time, their roots narrowing them back together. "You couldn't just wait," Willis said. Harper replied, "You left." The words landed like a verdict. Rick Monroe, the bartender, stepped outside and said, "Take it somewhere else," then went back in, assuming the instruction was enough. It wasn't. The crowd thickened, now including Alan Brooks, Jeff Carter, Samuel Price, men drawn by proximity rather than allegiance. Someone suggested a coin flip. Someone else said, "Grow up." The laughter came again, louder this time, and Harper's jaw tightened. "You done?" he asked. Willis stepped closer. "I said I was here first." A shove followed, quick and awkward, more insult than injury, but it changed the posture of everyone watching. Brooks moved between them and said, "Hey," hands out, then hesitated when both men kept talking past him. Harper backed away a few steps, turned, and walked toward his car, the crowd interpreting the movement differently. Some saw retreat, others saw promise. He opened the door, reached under the seat, and came back with a handgun, held low, not raised yet. "Back up," he said. The words were calm, almost instructional. Someone said, "Put that away." Someone else said, "Jesus." The first shot sounded like a mechanical failure, a sharp crack swallowed by engines and music. The second shot corrected the misunderstanding. People ran in different directions, colliding as the narrow lanes funneled them back toward the center. Harper fired again, then again, the distance between targets measured in steps. By the time the sound stopped, 8 men were down, Willis among them, and the parking lot had become a place no one knew how to leave. Sirens approached from streets still unaware, and those who remained stood still, staring at the painted lines beneath their feet, trying to understand how a space meant for waiting had ended with no time left. The first 911 call reached dispatcher Linda Kessler at 10:51 p.m., her log later showing overlapping lines as callers spoke over one another, each insisting urgency without clarity. "Shots fired," one voice said. Another corrected it. People are down. Kessler asked for an address and received 3 different answers, all describing the same place without naming it. A parking lot behind a bar that everyone assumed the dispatcher would recognize. She dispatched the nearest units anyway, instructing them to stage until backup arrived, a precaution that would later be questioned. Deputy Mark Reynolds arrived first, pulling his cruiser in at an angle that blocked the entrance, headlights washing over bodies on the asphalt, then men crouched behind cars, unsure whether the shooting had ended. Reynolds stepped out with his weapon drawn and shouted, "Hands where I can see them," his voice cutting through the confusion long enough to separate the living from the dead. Alan Brooks tried to speak, then stopped, pointing instead toward the far end of the lot where Harper had been last seen. Inside Miller's Tavern, Rick Monroe locked the door and told the remaining patrons to get down, then immediately wondered if he had waited too long to do either. Ambulances arrived in pairs, paramedics moving with rehearsed speed that felt out of place against the stillness of the scene. Jeff Carter was conscious when they reached him, repeating, "I wasn't even in it," until his words slurred and stopped. Others showed no signs of life, their positions marking the path Harper had taken as he moved across the lot, a line that investigators would later trace with tape. Harper himself was gone, his car missing from the space that had started the argument, leaving behind only the indentation of tires and an open door on Willis's sedan. As units canvassed nearby roads, Harper sat in his Chevy a mile away, engine off, radio silent, the handgun resting on the passenger seat. He watched the clock on the dashboard tick forward and said aloud, "It's done." A statement that meant nothing to anyone else. When officers approached, he raised his hands before they reached the door, saying, "I'm not running." At the station, he gave his name and answered questions with precision, correcting an officer who misstated the order of events. "He walked away first," Harper said. Then he came back. When asked about the crowd, he shrugged. They didn't stop it. At the hospital, doctors moved between rooms, confirming deaths in a sequence that felt procedural until the count reached 8, at which point the number itself became the story. Tom Willis's wife arrived after midnight, asking where her husband was and being told to sit down first, a phrase that would later replay in her memory more vividly than anything else said that night. By dawn, the lot was empty except for tape and chalk, the space restored to stillness without resolution. And the town began to wake to news that reduced the night to a phrase no one had words to accept. By mid-morning, Detective Paul Menard stood at the edge of the taped perimeter with a clipboard and a camera, looking at the painted lines like they might explain human behavior if studied long enough. He assigned evidence markers to shell casings, photographed the scuffed patches where men had fallen, and asked Reynolds to walk him through the first minutes on scene. Reynolds pointed with his flashlight, even though it was daylight. "Here," he said, indicating the entrance lane. People were behind cars. No one knew if he was still shooting. Menard nodded, then turned to the crowd of witnesses gathered near the bar's back door, now sober, now uncomfortable, their voices quieter than they had been the night before. He called Mike Ellison first, the man who had watched the argument begin without stepping in. Ellison rubbed his eyes and said, "It was nothing at first." Menard asked, "What's nothing?" Ellison hesitated. "You know, parking, guys talking." Menard wrote it down and asked who laughed. Ellison looked away. "People laughed," he said, as if naming one person would make him responsible. Next was Alan Brooks, hands still shaking slightly as he described stepping between Harper and Willis. "I told them to stop," Brooks said. Menard asked what exactly he said. Brooks swallowed. "I said, Hey, come on. Menard looked up. That's it? Brooks's face tightened. What do you want me to say? Behind Brooks, Samuel Price spoke to another witness in a low voice. He went to his car. I saw him. Menard heard it and turned. Price, tell me that again. Price nodded quickly. He went to his car like he was leaving. Then he came back with it. Menard asked, With what? Price answered, A gun. Menard asked why no one left when they saw it. Price's mouth opened and closed once before he said, I thought it was a scare. Menard wrote that down too, the phrase that would return later like a confession. Inside the bar, Rick Monroe cleaned the same glass twice, while officers photographed the entrance and took his statement. I told them to take it somewhere else, Monroe said. Menard asked, Did you call? Monroe's jaw tightened. No. Menard didn't argue. He didn't need to. The answer sat in the room by itself. Across town, Harper was being processed, fingerprints taken, clothing bagged, hands photographed for residue. In the interview room, Menard sat across from him and set a Polaroid of the lot on the table, the bodies blurred by the camera's limitations. Harper stared at it without flinching. Menard asked, Over a parking spot. Harper didn't correct him. He said, He made it public. Menard asked what that meant. Harper replied, He made everyone watch. Menard leaned forward. And then what? Harper's voice remained flat. Then it was decided. Menard asked, By who? Harper held his gaze and said, By the room. The wording was strange, too abstract for a man who had otherwise spoken in concrete details, and Menard wrote it down anyway, because it sounded like the closest thing Harper offered to explanation. Outside, reporters gathered at the perimeter as workers repainted the faded lines, a maintenance decision made quickly, as if the town believed new paint could cover what had happened on old asphalt. The arraignment took place 2 days later in a courtroom that smelled faintly of cleaning solvent. The benches filled with people who had slept poorly and now sat too straight, as if posture could compensate for exhaustion. Judge Eleanor Wright read the charges slowly, pausing after the number 8, letting it settle before continuing. Harper stood beside his attorney, Frank Delaney, hands folded, eyes forward, listening as if the words described a different night. Delaney requested a brief recess and leaned in to whisper, Let me talk. But Harper nodded once and said, I understand, without looking at him. Outside the room, Tom Willis's brother waited with his hands clenched, repeating, It was a spot. To no one in particular, the phrase functioning as both explanation and accusation. When proceedings resumed, the prosecution outlined its theory with clinical restraint. The argument had ended. Harper had left. Harper had returned armed. And 8 men had paid for a choice that could have been abandoned. The defense countered by compressing the timeline, insisting the dispute never truly paused, that the crowd kept the men in orbit around each other, that leaving the lot would have required pushing past people who treated the confrontation like entertainment. Afterward, in the hallway, Delaney told a reporter, This wasn't premeditation. It was escalation. And the word followed him into print, repeated until it lost specificity. Back at the lot, detectives returned with a surveyor to document distances more precisely, measuring from Harper's car to the entrance, from the first casing to the last, translating steps into feet so jurors could later picture intent. Deputy Reynolds watched and said, quietly to Menard, It's not far. A comment that could be read either way. Menard replied, Far enough, and wrote it down. Witnesses continued to arrive at the station, each one bringing a version of the night that leaned toward absolution. Mike Ellison insisted the laughter had been nervous, not mocking. Samuel Price said he'd expected someone older to step in. Rick Monroe said he thought the argument would cool once last call approached. Menard listened and asked the same question each time. When did you think it was serious? The answers clustered after the gun appeared, too late to matter. In a separate room, Harper's clothing was laid out on a table, tagged and photographed, his jacket still carrying the faint smell of oil and sweat. A technician asked if he wanted water. Harper said, no. The technician asked if he needed anything. Harper said, I need it written right. And the technician nodded without understanding. That afternoon, ambulances returned to the hospital not with patients, but with paperwork, charts closing the loop that had begun the night before. Nurses spoke in lowered voices, careful not to assign blame aloud. By evening, the town had settled into a brittle quiet. Businesses open but subdued, conversations truncated when someone approached. The lot sat empty again, lines brighter now, signs posted that hadn't existed before, each one an attempt to declare order after the fact. And yet, as people drove past, slowing unconsciously, it was clear that paint and signage addressed only space, not the decisions that had filled it, not the moment when a crowd chose to watch instead of end what was unfolding in front of them. The weeks before trial stretched the town into a prolonged state of rehearsal. Each conversation, a quieter version of testimony that would later be given under oath. Detective Menard spent afternoons re-interviewing witnesses, not because their stories changed dramatically, but because small shifts revealed where memory gave way to self-protection. When he sat across from Mike Ellison a second time, Ellison leaned back and said, I told you what I saw, then paused and added, I just didn't think it mattered. Menard asked him to define mattered. Ellison shrugged. It was still just words then. Menard slid a photo across the table, taken minutes before the first shot, showing Harper near his car, the crowd behind him loosely arranged, no one clearly leaving. That's still just words? Menard asked. Ellison didn't answer. In another room, Alan Brooks practiced his testimony aloud, repeating the same sentence until it lost meaning. I tried to stop it. His wife listened from the doorway and finally said, You tried to say something. And Brooks nodded as if the correction hurt less. At Miller's Tavern, Rick Monroe reopened under pressure from the owner, who insisted the bar could not stay closed indefinitely. Monroe wiped down the counter slowly, watching customers choose stools farther apart than before. When one patron asked, You ever think about calling sooner? Monroe replied, Every time I lock the door, and changed the subject. Across town, Frank Delaney met with Harper daily, laying out strategy with legal clarity that contrasted sharply with Harper's emotional flatness. They're going to say you left and came back, Delaney said, tapping the table. Harper replied, I never left the situation. Delaney tried again. You left the spot. Harper shook his head. The room stayed with me. Delaney stopped arguing, realizing the phrasing would sound evasive to a jury, but represented Harper's genuine perception of the night. At the hospital, Jeff Carter's brother collected personal effects in a brown envelope, flipping the wallet open and closed as if checking for something missing. A nurse told him, We did everything we could, and he said, I know, without conviction. As opening day approached, reporters framed the case around the absurdity of its origin, repeating the phrase parking dispute until it hardened into explanation. Menard watched one broadcast from his office and turned it off midway through, aware that the simplicity erased the hours of hesitation that had mattered most. He reviewed his notes late into the night, circling the same phrases again and again. Thought it would end. didn't want to make it worse, someone else would step in, recognizing them as a pattern rather than excuses. On the eve of trial, Harper sat alone in a holding cell and told Delaney, "They'll make it about me." And Delaney replied, "They have to." Harper looked at the wall and said, "That's not where it started." Outside, the lot behind Miller's Tavern remained open. Cars parked carefully within newly painted lines, drivers avoiding eye contact as they passed the place where a crowd once decided to watch instead of stop, a decision that now waited to be judged one witness at a time. The trial opened under fluorescent lights that flattened every face in the room, stripping emotion down to posture and tone. And prosecutor Daniel Hargreave began by pointing to a photograph of the parking lot taken in daylight, its neat geometry at odds with the testimony that would follow. "This is not a mystery," he said, pacing slowly. "It's a sequence." He described the argument, the separation, the return, emphasizing the moment Harper walked back from his car with a weapon as a deliberate choice that transformed inconvenience into intent. When Mike Ellison took the stand, Hargreave asked him to recount the laughter. Ellison shifted in his seat. "It wasn't mean," he said. "It was just noise." Hargreave leaned closer. "Did it change anything?" Ellison hesitated, then said, "It made him stop walking." The room went quiet. Alan Brooks followed, describing how he stepped between the men and felt the crowd press in behind him. "I didn't know who to listen to," he said. The defense objected, and Judge Wright overruled it, instructing Brooks to continue. "I thought if I pushed too hard, it would turn," Brooks said. It turned anyway. When Rick Monroe testified, Hargreave asked why he went back inside after telling them to take it elsewhere. Monroe answered, "Because that's what usually works." The phrase hung there, unchallenged. On cross-examination, Frank Delaney guided witnesses back to uncertainty, asking them to describe distances in the dark, to recall who stood where when bodies were moving and voices overlapped. He replayed emergency calls and asked jurors to note how little could be understood in real time. When Harper took the stand, Delaney kept his questions narrow. "Did the argument ever end?" Harper said, "No." "Did you feel you could leave?" Harper replied, "Not without it following." Hargreave's cross was brief and sharp. "You could have driven away," he said. Harper answered, "I did. Then I stopped." "Why?" Hargreave asked. Harper looked at the jury and said, "Because they were still there." The simplicity unsettled the room. Outside, families listened to the testimony through the walls, catching fragments that confirmed their worst assumptions or complicated them beyond comfort. During recess, Tom Willis's brother confronted Delaney in the hallway and said, "You're making excuses." Delaney replied, "I'm making a record," and walked away. As the days progressed, the narrative hardened around moments rather than motives. Jurors instructed to weigh actions without speculating on thought. When closing arguments ended, the judge reminded them that the law did not require them to understand why, only whether the choices met the standards set before them. Deliberations lasted 2 days, during which the town waited, conversation suspended, the parking lot behind, Miller's Tavern filling and emptying as usual. Drivers careful, then gradually less so, as if habit were already eroding the lesson even before a verdict could fix it in place. The verdict came on a gray afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look unfinished, and Judge Wright waited until the room was completely still before reading it aloud. Guilty on the primary counts, the specific language formal and heavy, each word placed carefully, as if precision could contain grief. Harper did not react visibly. His shoulders didn't move, His face didn't change, and for a moment it was impossible to tell whether he had processed the sound at all. Frank Delaney leaned toward him and whispered, "We'll appeal." But Harper stared straight ahead and said, "Write it right," the same phrase he'd used in the station, as if the record mattered more than the outcome. In the first row, Tom Willis's wife closed her eyes and gripped the bench until her knuckles went pale, not in relief, but in a kind of delayed exhaustion, the end of one process that never restored what had been lost. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked for statements and received only fragments, grief refusing to become sound bites. One family member said it was a parking spot, and another corrected him immediately. It was 8 men, an argument over what the case should be remembered as. Sentencing followed weeks later, and the judge spoke about deterrence, about the weight of public harm, about how violence in shared spaces expands beyond its immediate victims. Harper listened and finally asked to speak, not to apologize, but to clarify. "They keep saying the spot," he said. "It wasn't the spot." Judge Wright asked, "Then what was it?" Harper paused long enough that the courtroom held its breath. "It was the watching," he said. And then he stopped, unable or unwilling to translate the sentence into something the law could use. After he was led away, the town began the slow work of returning to routine, a process that felt less like healing than like forgetting. Miller's Tavern stayed open, but the backlot was altered. Brighter lights installed, lines repainted, a sign added that read, "Reserved parking," as if designation could prevent escalation. Rick Monroe kept locking the door earlier than he used to, and when asked why, he would say, "It gets loud," then glance toward the lot and fall silent. Detective Menard filed the last reports and boxed the evidence, aware that the file would now live in storage and memory rather than active work. He drove past the lot one night months later and saw 2 men arguing over a space, gesturing sharply, then stopping when a third person stepped between them and said something firm. The argument ended quickly, the kind of mundane resolution that never becomes news. Menard watched from his car and felt a strange relief that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with timing. Yet, most nights were not that clean. The town's vigilance faded in uneven patches, replaced by the old assumption that ordinary conflict stays ordinary. People still circled the lot looking for spaces, still felt ownership over small conveniences, still waited too long before intervening because intervening felt socially risky. The case, when mentioned, was compressed into a line: 8 men killed over a parking spot. That compression made it easier to repeat, but less accurate. And accuracy mattered because the real danger had not been the spot itself, but the way the dispute was allowed to linger, fed by an audience, reinforced by hesitation, and carried forward by the belief that time would solve it. 8 men died because time was spent watching. The town continued to live on the same streets and park in the same lot. And the lines on the asphalt stayed bright and obedient, a visual order that concealed how quickly the social order had failed when it mattered. In the months after sentencing, the case slipped from headlines into a quieter phase, where its influence became harder to measure but easier to feel. Linda Kessler, the dispatcher, transferred to day shifts after years on nights, telling her supervisor, "I just don't want to hear that tone anymore," though she never specified which one. When a call came in about a disturbance in a parking lot across town, she paused longer than protocol required before dispatching units, her voice calm but insistent. "Stay on the line with me." Deputy Reynolds noticed similar pauses in himself, moments where routine no longer felt neutral, where a raised voice in a public space triggered memory before judgment. One evening, he responded to a minor altercation outside a grocery store and stepped between two men before either had finished speaking. "It ends here," he said, surprising himself with the firmness of it. The men backed off, muttering, and Reynolds stood there longer than necessary, absorbing the awkward looks from bystanders who had expected a show. At Miller's Tavern, business slowly returned to something resembling normal, though the back lot never quite regained its old rhythm. Drivers parked more carefully at first, then gradually less so, habits eroding as new patrons arrived without context. Rick Monroe kept a closer eye on the door than he once had, stepping outside sooner when voices rose, saying things like, "Not here," or "Take it down the street." Phrases that carried more weight now because he did not wait to repeat them. Some nights it worked. Other nights it only delayed arguments until they crossed the threshold into public space. Detective Menard was invited to speak at a regional training session on crowd dynamics. His presentation stripped of names and locations. The story reduced to principles that fit on slides. Diffusion of responsibility, escalation through audience, misinterpretation of pauses as resolution. During questions, an officer asked, "So what should someone have done?" Menard answered, "Anything sooner," and let the silence do the rest. Privately, he knew that answer frustrated people because it offered no checklist, no clean intervention point. The truth was messier. The danger lay in waiting for certainty, in assuming clarity would arrive before action was needed. Tom Willis's wife moved away the following year, telling neighbors she needed quieter streets, though what she meant was fewer reminders. When she packed, she left behind a box of photographs taken before the night. Images that showed her husband standing in ordinary places, smiling without context. Proof that nothing about him belonged to a cautionary tale. On the anniversary, a small group gathered near the lot without permits or speeches, standing together for a few minutes before dispersing, the gesture informal enough to avoid argument. A passing driver slowed, rolled down his window, and asked, "What happened here?" Someone answered, "A long time ago," and the driver nodded and moved on. The question lingered longer than the answer, hanging over the space like a low hum. Over time, the case became a reference point only when something similar threatened to unfold, its relevance activated by proximity rather than memory. People who had been there understood that the most dangerous moment had not been when the gun appeared, but when it still seemed unnecessary to act. When the argument was just loud enough to watch and not loud enough to stop. That understanding rarely translated cleanly into policy or slogans. But it altered behavior in small, uneven ways, shaping choices that would never be recorded. Indiana, 1981 did not leave behind a monument or a rule book. Only a residue of caution that surfaced unpredictably, reminding those who felt it that ordinary disputes become lethal not through inevitability, but through delay. Years later, when the case was mentioned at all, it surfaced in conversations, stripped of names, reduced to a cautionary reference that people half remembered and rarely questioned. At a local hardware store, two men once argued loudly over a loading space, their voices rising in the familiar pattern, until a third stepped between them and said, "Not worth it," with a firmness that carried more authority than either expected. The argument dissolved, not because the words were persuasive, but because they arrived early. Detective Menard, retired by then, heard about the incident from a former colleague and recognized the structure immediately. The same early stage where outcome is still flexible, where intervention feels excessive precisely because it works. He thought about how the Indiana case had been taught and mistaught over the years, often framed as an example of uncontrollable rage rather than collective hesitation. In lectures and reports, the shooter's psychology had been examined exhaustively, while the environment that sustained the escalation received less attention, its role acknowledged but rarely emphasized. Menard believed this imbalance made the lesson easier to ignore, allowing people to believe the danger resided in rare individuals rather than common situations. At Miller's Tavern, ownership changed hands, and the new manager, unfamiliar with the history, considered repainting the lot again to optimize space. An older employee suggested keeping the layout as it was. "Why?" the manager asked. The employee replied, "It works better this way." Unable to articulate what better meant, without reopening a story the town preferred to keep dormant. On busy nights, the backlot still filled unevenly, drivers circling, impatience building in small increments, the same ingredients assembling without ceremony. Most nights ended without incident, reinforcing the belief that caution was unnecessary, that the past belonged to a different time. Yet for those who had witnessed the aftermath, the memory remained accessible, triggered by the tone of an argument rather than its content, by the presence of an audience rather than the severity of the words. Linda Kessler, now supervising dispatchers, listened carefully to how new hires handled disturbance calls, correcting them when they rushed callers off the line. "Stay with them," she would say. "Let it slow down." The advice came from experience rather than policy, a quiet inheritance passed down without attribution. Rick Monroe, no longer bartending, still avoided that side of town, choosing longer routes that kept him from seeing the lot at night. When asked why, he said, "It's loud there," though the noise he meant was not audible. Tom Willis's children grew up hearing fragments of the story, enough to know their father had not been reckless or foolish, enough to understand that his death was tied to a moment that refused to stay small. As adults, they visited the place once, standing where the lines intersected, noting how ordinary it looked, how resistant it was to meaning. They left without ceremony, carrying with them the knowledge that the most dangerous part of the night had not been the violence itself, but the long stretch before it, when everyone believed there was still time. The case endured because it contradicted the desire for clear warnings, insisting instead that catastrophe often announces itself as inconvenience, that shared spaces magnify hesitation, and that delay, once normalized, can become fatal. Indiana, 1981, remained a lesson without a headline, resurfacing only when someone recognized its shape in real time and chose to act before the watching began again. On the 40th anniversary, there was no official commemoration, no press release, no camera crews standing where the tape once hung. Only a brief notice in the local paper that listed 8 names under a small heading most readers skipped. Detective Menard read it at his kitchen table and folded the page carefully, the habit of record-keeping outliving the work itself. He thought about how the night had been explained over the years, and how explanation had gradually replaced recollection. The story smoothed until it fit comfortably into a sentence that people could repeat without pausing. At Miller's Tavern, the current staff worked an ordinary shift, unaware that the date carried weight, dealing with the usual complaints about music volume and last call, stepping outside occasionally to break up arguments before they took shape. One bartender heard raised voices near the back and said, "Take it easy," early enough that the words still worked, then watched the men separate and leave in opposite directions. He didn't think of it as prevention, only as good management. Across town, Linda Kessler listened to a late call about a disturbance behind a closed business, her voice steady as she kept the caller talking until officers arrived. "You're doing fine," she said, not to reassure but to slow. the moment down. The patrol car lights reflected off empty asphalt. The scene resolved before it could accumulate meaning. Rick Monroe, older now, passed the lot on his way home and noticed new paint on the lines, brighter than before. The surface maintained without reference to what it once held. He parked briefly and stood there, hands in his pockets, listening to the hum of traffic beyond the building, the sound unchanged over decades. He remembered telling the men to take it somewhere else and believed, as he always had, that he meant to stop it, even if his meaning had arrived too late to matter. Tom Willis's grandchildren grew up without knowing the place by sight, only by the careful way adults avoided certain explanations, the pauses that followed questions about the past. When one of them asked why people fought over parking, an older relative said, "Because it feels personal," and left it at that. The simplicity was accurate enough to function. As time passed, the case retreated further into the background, not forgotten, but uninvoked. A reference that activated only when conditions aligned and someone sensed its shape returning. The lesson, such as it was, did not announce itself as urgency. It appeared as discomfort, the feeling that watching was no longer neutral, that waiting carried its own risk. Indiana, 1981, ended without a final scene that could be filmed or a conclusion that resolved responsibility neatly. 8 men died because an argument was allowed to persist, because a crowd transformed inconvenience into performance, and because intervention felt socially premature until it was physically impossible. The parking lot remained functional and unremarkable, its lines repainted as needed, doing nothing to prevent the next dispute from starting there. What changed, unevenly and invisibly, was the willingness of some to interrupt earlier, to accept awkwardness as the cost of prevention, to recognize that the most decisive moment in the story had passed long before anyone believed a decision was required. What remained hardest to articulate, even years later, was how ordinary the night continued to feel, right up until it stopped being survivable. People who had been there would later say they never sensed a turning point, only a gradual tightening, as if the space itself were closing in without warning. Mike Ellison, older now, explained it once to a coworker by saying, "If you'd asked me at any point before the gun came out whether someone would die, I'd have said no." And that answer, he realized, was the problem. The assumption that the worst requires advance notice persisted long after the case faded from public attention, reinforced by countless nights that ended without incident. At Miller's Tavern, arguments still happened, voices still rose, people still circled the lot looking for space, the same ingredients assembling without ceremony. Most of the time, nothing followed, and each harmless outcome strengthened the belief that escalation is rare, that patience is safer than interruption. Detective Menard tried to address this belief when speaking to younger officers, reminding them that the absence of violence in similar situations did not make those situations safe, only unresolved. "You're not looking for the worst moment," he told them. "You're looking for the last easy one." The phrase stayed with some and passed over others. Linda Kessler noticed it in calls as well. How often callers minimized what they were witnessing, describing arguments as loud but manageable, adding qualifiers like "probably nothing" or "they'll work it out." She learned to treat those qualifiers as signals rather than reassurances, slowing the exchange, keeping people engaged long enough for help to arrive. Rick Monroe, asked once whether he blamed himself, answered, "I don't know where blame fits," and changed the subject, the question itself feeling misplaced. The truth resisted neat allocation. The shooter was accountable for his actions, but the conditions that allowed those actions to unfold had been shared, reinforced by habits so common they were invisible until they failed. In private, Tom Willis's family spoke less about the argument and more about the waiting, the stretch of time when nothing definitive happened, when intervention would have felt unnecessary and therefore intrusive. That stretch was what haunted them, not because it guaranteed a different outcome, but because it offered the possibility of one. Over time, the case became a quiet reference point for those who recognized its pattern elsewhere, surfacing not as a warning, but as a sensation. The feeling that a situation was lingering too long, that the social cost of stepping in was shrinking compared to the potential cost of doing nothing. Indiana, 1981, remained unresolved in this way. Not legally, but socially. Its significance dependent on recognition rather than remembrance. 8 men died over a parking spot. The phrase still repeated because it was easy to say, even though it concealed the real mechanism. A sequence of ordinary decisions made by many people that collectively delayed intervention until delay itself became the deciding factor. In later retellings, the night acquired a false symmetry, as if it had moved cleanly from argument to violence, when in reality it sagged and stretched, time behaving unevenly for those inside it. Alan Brooks once described it as standing in a hallway that keeps getting narrower, a metaphor he hadn't meant to offer, but which stuck because it captured the sense of compression without drama. He remembered stepping forward and back, hands raised, waiting for someone else to take over, someone older, louder, officially responsible. When asked why he didn't push harder, he said, "I didn't want to be the guy who made it worse." And then paused, recognizing the cost of that calculation. Mike Ellison recalled the moment. Harper went to his car as relief, the assumption that departure equaled resolution. "I thought, good, it's done," he said. And the admission revealed how deeply people equated movement with closure. The return broke that logic, but even then the crowd hesitated, uncertain whether escalation was real or theatrical, whether the presence of a weapon was threat or bluff. Samuel Price said later, "I thought he wanted us to see it." And that belief delayed his own exit, the decision to stay made in order to confirm what he feared. Inside the bar, Rick Monroe counted minutes until last call, treating time as a solvent that would dissolve the argument if left to work, unaware that the crowd outside was using time to accumulate attention rather than patience. When the shots came, witnesses described a strange clarity, the moment when uncertainty collapsed into certainty, and everyone understood at once that the earlier hesitation had been misplaced. The clarity arrived too late to be useful. In interviews conducted years afterward, survivors struggled to articulate this lag, the gap between recognition and response that defined the night more than anger or intent. Detective Menard believed this gap was the true subject of the case, the element least captured by evidence and most resistant to instruction. "People think you need a reason to step in," he said once. "You don't. You need a moment." That statement was not policy, only observation, and it circulated informally among those who had reason to listen. Linda Kessler carried a similar observation into her work, noting how often callers waited for permission to be concerned, how they framed urgency as embarrassment rather than risk. She learned to interrupt that framing gently but firmly, saying, "It's okay to be wrong about this," a phrase that allowed people to act without certainty. The case itself receded further into the past, its details thinning as those who had been there moved away or grew tired of explaining. Yet its structure persisted, reappearing whenever a dispute lingered in public space, when voices rose without resolution and an audience gathered without purpose. Indiana, 1981, did not end with a lesson that could be posted or enforced. only with an unresolved question about timing. How long is too long to wait? And who decides when waiting becomes complicity? 8 men died because that decision was deferred collectively, parceled out to the crowd until no one felt responsible for making it. The story endures because that deferral remains familiar, repeating wherever ordinary conflict is mistaken for harmless noise and where the desire to avoid awkwardness outweighs the instinct to interrupt before the narrowing hallway closes completely. What the official record never captured was how the crowd functioned as a single, shifting organism, its attention moving in waves that altered behavior without announcing itself. Detective Menard tried once to describe this to a prosecutor by drawing circles on a legal pad, smaller ones forming and dissolving around the argument as people arrived and left, curiosity acting as gravity. No one wanted to be first to leave, he said, and no one wanted to be first to stop it. That tension between departure and intervention defined the middle of the night, the stretch where everything was still technically reversible. Alan Brooks remembered hearing someone say, "Just let them talk," a sentence that granted permission to wait without naming the cost of waiting. Mike Ellison remembered the opposite impulse, the urge to step back because proximity felt like endorsement, the fear that staying meant choosing a side. These impulses collided and canceled each other out, leaving the argument suspended. When Harper returned with the gun, witnesses described a brief recalibration rather than immediate panic, a moment when people reassessed whether the threat was real. "Okay, I thought he was trying to scare us," Samuel Price said. "I thought if I moved, it would look like I was scared." The social pressure not to overreact proved stronger than the instinct to leave, especially with an audience present. Inside the bar, Rick Monroe later admitted he heard the first crack and still hesitated, telling himself it was a dropped tray or a blown speaker. "I didn't want to run outside and make it worse," he said, a sentence that mirrored half a dozen others taken that night. The second shot erased ambiguity and introduced urgency, but by then urgency had nowhere to go. The exits funneled bodies back into each other, the painted lines guiding movement toward the center instead of away. Deputy Reynolds, arriving minutes later, would note how people clustered even after the shooting stopped, as if distance required instruction. "I had to tell them to move," he said. "They just stood there." At the hospital, doctors noticed the same paralysis in reverse. Families, waiting in hallways for confirmation they already suspected, unable to ask the question that would end the waiting. Tom Willis's brother paced a straight line between 2 doors, counting steps, then stopping when a nurse approached because stopping felt easier than hearing. The case file documented injuries and trajectories with precision, but it could not diagram hesitation, could not mark the seconds when action felt premature and therefore didn't happen. Years later, when similar incidents occurred elsewhere, Menard recognized the same preconditions in reports that emphasized suddenness without acknowledging delay. "It's never sudden," he would say. "It just feels that way, because no one marks the middle." Indiana, 1981, was defined by that unmarked middle, the stretch of time where prevention still had room, but lacked permission. 8 men died, not because no one cared, but because care was deferred, parceled out among many until it lost the power to move anyone. The story persists because that deferral remains common, because public spaces still reward watching over interrupting, and because the moment when interruption works best rarely announces itself as necessary until it has already passed. As the years accumulated, the case acquired an afterlife that existed mostly in silences, in the things people stopped saying out loud. Frank Delaney retired and boxed his files, keeping the Harper case longer than most, not because it troubled him legally, but because it resisted narrative closure. He once told a colleague, "Every case wants to be about a person. This one was about a room," and then laughed as if the phrasing embarrassed him. In a continuing education seminar, a younger attorney asked how to argue crowd influence without excusing individual action. Delaney answered, "You don't excuse it. You show how it narrows choices," and moved on. Judge Wright, years after sentencing, declined an interview about the case, telling a clerk, "The law did what it could," a sentence that functioned as both defense and boundary. Linda Kessler watched new dispatch software roll out with features designed to triage urgency, color-coding calls by severity. She overrode the system more than once, upgrading disturbances that sounded too calm. Explaining later, calm is sometimes the problem. Deputy Reynolds became a sergeant and trained recruits to insert themselves early into public disputes, even when it felt socially clumsy. "If you feel awkward," he told them, "you're probably on time." Some laughed, others wrote it down. At Miller's Tavern, the lot hosted weddings worth of cars, and none of the old regulars noticed the difference, except for Rick Monroe, who had learned to read posture and proximity the way others read signs. He stepped outside once when two drivers squared off and said, "We're not doing this," without raising his voice. One driver scoffed, the other backed down, and the moment evaporated, leaving behind only the faint embarrassment that signaled prevention had worked. Mike Ellison, asked by a reporter years later what he would do differently, said, "I'd end it sooner," then paused. "I wouldn't wait to see how it turns out." The reporter asked, "And what?" Ellison replied, "The watching." And the word landed with a finality that needed no elaboration. Alan Brooks avoided interviews altogether, explaining to friends that he had said everything he could and that repetition felt like erosion. He had learned, he said, that memory wears down when it's handled too often, becoming smoother and less accurate with each telling. Tom Willis's family marked the anniversary privately, reading the names aloud in a living room that grew quieter each year as children aged and questions changed shape. When a teenager asked, "Why didn't anyone stop it?" an adult answered, "They thought they were waiting for the right moment," and left it there, unwilling to burden the explanation with accusation. The parking lot itself offered no cues, no plaque or line to signal its past, only fresh paint and efficient drainage, a place that functioned as designed. Yet for those attuned to its history, the space retained a charge, a reminder that public order depends less on rules than on timing, less on authority than on willingness. Indiana, 1981, remained instructive, not because it was unique, but because it was common, a convergence of habits that appear harmless until they synchronize. 8 men died because the middle of the story went unclaimed, because the interval when interruption was easiest was mistaken for the interval when it was unnecessary. The case endures wherever people hesitate to be first, wherever discomfort is avoided in favor of waiting, and wherever the ordinary is trusted to resolve itself without help. In the final years before the case slipped completely into archival quiet, its influence survived mostly in moments that never made records, decisions taken early enough to erase themselves. Detective Menard noticed it one evening at a county fair when 2 men began arguing near a food truck over who had been next in line, their voices sharpening as people gathered. Before the exchange could harden into performance, a volunteer stepped between them and said, "Hey, pick a side or I'll pick for you." A clumsy sentence that worked precisely because it arrived before either man had invested too much pride. The argument ended in muttered insults and separation, the crowd dispersing with mild disappointment. Menard watched and thought of how invisible prevention is, how success leaves no evidence beyond awkwardness. At Miller's Tavern, the same pattern played out in quieter forms. Rick Monroe, now only occasionally filling in, intervened at the first raised voice, not waiting for confirmation that he was needed. "Take it outside," he would say, then correct himself. "Actually, take it home." And the distinction mattered. Patrons complained sometimes, accusing him of overreacting, and Monroe accepted the irritation as part of the job. "Better mad than gone," he said once, without context. Linda Kessler trained new dispatchers to treat silence as data, to notice when callers stopped describing events and began asking permission to worry. "That's when you slow it down," she told them. "That's when you stay." The advice did not appear in manuals, but it spread through repetition, a counterweight to the instinct to minimize. Alan Brooks, who had avoided the lot for years, drove through it one night by accident and parked briefly, testing whether the space still carried weight. It did. He sat in his car and remembered the shove, the laughter, the moment when he had stepped forward and then stopped, uncertain whether his presence mattered. He told himself, as he had many times, that he would not stop next time. That hesitation was the only part of the night he owned. Across town, Tom Willis's grandchildren grew older, their understanding of the story evolving from fragments into questions about crowds and responsibility. When one asked, "Would it happen again?" an adult answered, "Only if people wait." A response that shifted the story from past to present. The parking lot remained efficient and unremarkable, a functional space that did nothing to signal its history, its normalcy both reassuring and dangerous. Drivers still circled for spots, impatience still rose in small increments, and most nights ended without incident, reinforcing the belief that escalation is rare. Yet those who recognized the pattern knew that rarity was not protection, only luck distributed unevenly over time. Indiana, 1981, persisted as a reference point for timing rather than motive. A reminder that the decisive moments in public conflict often arrive disguised as inconvenience, and that the cost of acting too early is embarrassment, while the cost of acting too late is permanent. The case ultimately became a story people told in halves, the beginning reduced to a parking spot and the end reduced to a sentence, while the middle, the part that actually mattered, remained harder to repeat without implicating everyone who had been there. Detective Menard understood this better than anyone, because he had watched the narrative harden over time into something portable and safe, a version that assigned responsibility cleanly and allowed the rest to disappear. He once told Linda Kessler over coffee, "If they remember the spot, they don't have to remember the waiting." And Kessler nodded, because she had heard waiting on the phone line more times than she could count. Callers delaying their own urgency with qualifiers, hoping the situation would resolve before they had to name it. Rick Monroe carried the same knowledge in a different form, in the way he stepped outside early now, interrupting arguments before they gathered an audience, knowing that once people start watching, the dispute stops being about resolution and becomes about performance. And Alan Brooks, who had stepped between two men that night and then hesitated, lived with the fact that his single word, "Hey," had been too small for the moment it arrived in, even if it had been all he could produce inside the pressure of a crowd. The legal system did what it was built to do. It identified a person, attached charges, delivered a verdict, and placed the outcome into storage. But the case's true mechanism did not sit neatly in a file. It lived in the way a public space can turn ordinary conflict into spectacle, in the way responsibility thins when many people share it, and in the way time can be mistaken for a solution when it is actually a fuse. 8 men died in Indiana in 1981, and the event became a kind of local geometry, a line traced through future situations whenever voices rose and bystanders gathered. The record of the night is made of statements and photographs and measured distances. But the most decisive element was never measurable: the interval when intervention still felt optional. That interval is what the town learned to notice, unevenly, imperfectly, through awkward interruptions and early exits that prevented scenes from forming. Nothing about the parking lot changed that could be cited as a guarantee. Paint and lights helped, but they did not govern choices. What changed, where it changed at all, was timing. Who stepped in first, who refused to wait for certainty, who accepted being socially intrusive before the situation became physically irreversible. Indiana, 1981, remains a story, not because it is unique, but because it is structurally familiar. A reminder that the worst outcomes often begin in spaces designed for nothing worse than inconvenience, and that the most important decisions in public conflicts are usually made before anyone believes a decision is required.